Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. I work the graveyard shift at a 24-hour convenience store in California. It's one of those places that's open all night, no matter what, and most of the time the customers are few and far between. The type of place that serves a very specific crowd. The night owls, the people who've just gotten off late shifts, the truck drivers passing through, the ones who don't mind the quiet of the dead hours. At first, I didn't think much of the graveyard shift. It seemed like an easy gig, sitting behind the counter, ringing up a few customers, and occasionally stocking the shelves. Nothing that required much thought. It was my third week working there when I started to feel the creepiness. The store is in a part of town that's not exactly unsafe, but it's not exactly safe either. You know those areas where there's a lot of low-rent apartments? The kind where people can't afford to live in nicer places but aren't poor enough to live on the streets? That's where I was. The store is tucked between a rundown motel and a small laundromat, with a small parking lot out front that only fits about 10 cars. It's just off the main road, so people driving by can easily spot it, but it's also a little isolated, hidden behind a row of buildings. I never thought much about it at first. People came and went. Sure, there were some strange folks at night, but I figured that was just part of working the shift. There was always the drunk guy who stumbled in around 2 a.m. and tried to buy cigarettes with the change from a crumpled up dollar, or the guy who wanted to buy a pack of gum and paid with a $10 bill, but left without his change, mumbling something about how he just needed to get something for his kid. Nothing that felt particularly dangerous, just odd. It was just part of the job. But that night, the night everything changed, felt different. It was around 2:30 a.m. and the store was practically empty. The hum of the freezer in the back was the only noise, and the flickering fluorescent lights above made the place feel even more sterile, like an abandoned hospital hallway. There was only one car in the parking lot, an old beat-up sedan that had been there for a while. The parking lot was nearly empty, only a few other cars scattered around, none of them moving. The place felt eerie, still. I was behind the counter, absent-mindedly wiping it down and rearranging the candy bars. My eyelids felt heavy, and I couldn't help but yawn as I stared at the clock. It was the usual lull before the late-night rush, and my mind was starting to drift when I glanced up. That's when I first saw him. At first, it didn't strike me as odd. There was a man pacing back and forth in front of the window. He looked like he was just passing by, maybe someone out for a late-night walk. He was wearing a dark jacket, the kind that looked weathered and worn, and his jeans were frayed at the edges. His face was partially obscured by the hood of his jacket, but his body language caught my attention. He wasn't walking in a straight line. He was pacing, back and forth, like he couldn't decide which direction to go. I figured he was just some guy out for a late-night stroll, maybe waiting for someone or just trying to kill time. I've seen it before. But there was something about the way he moved that made me uneasy. He wasn't just walking. He was staring. Every few steps, he would stop, turn toward the window, and look inside for a moment before continuing his slow, erratic pace. I couldn't tell if he was looking at me, but I didn't want to find out. I shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, keeping my gaze on the register as I busied myself with a few menial tasks. I tried not to pay him too much attention. I knew that if I looked, it might make things worse. I didn't want him to think I was watching him. I told myself I was just being paranoid. It was just a man outside, maybe looking for something. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was doing more than just walking. It felt like he was watching me. Every few minutes, he would stop and stand in front of the window, his face slightly obscured by the darkness outside, but I could still see him staring, his eyes moving back and forth. I couldn't be sure if he was looking right at me or if it was just a coincidence, but I had this nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach that he knew I was watching him. The longer he paced, the more agitated I became. I glanced at the clock. It was 2:45 a.m. I hadn't noticed when the time had slipped by, but the minutes were starting to drag. The quiet was suffocating. Every time I glanced up, he was still there, pacing back and forth in front of the window. His eyes would meet mine for a split second before he turned away. I felt trapped behind the counter, unable to move, unsure of what to do. The store was empty, save for him, and I could feel the pressure building. I decided to distract myself. I grabbed my phone and started scrolling through it, hoping the sound of my fingers on the screen would drown out the growing discomfort. But as I was scrolling, something made me look up again. The man was standing directly in front of the window. I don't know why that moment stands out so clearly in my mind, but it does. It was like something in the air shifted, and I felt it. He was staring at me now, not casually glancing or peeking inside. No, this time it was different. His gaze was fixed, his eyes were dark, and there was something in them that made my blood run cold. I couldn't explain it, but the way he was looking at me made it feel like I was the only thing that mattered in the world to him at that moment. I didn't want to look away, but I felt myself doing it anyway. I couldn't help myself. I quickly turned my head back to my phone and pretended to read an email. I didn't want to make it obvious that I was noticing him too much, but I could feel his presence. It felt suffocating. The seconds dragged on, and I found myself holding my breath. When I finally gathered the courage to glance up again, he was gone. Just like that. I sat there for a moment, staring at the spot where he had been standing, half expecting him to reappear at any second. But the parking lot was still empty, and the car that had been parked there earlier was still there. I let out a shaky breath and tried to calm myself. "It's fine. It's fine," I told myself. Maybe he had just walked away. I wasn't sure what exactly I was feeling, but I was starting to feel easy. I knew I had to stay alert, but the thought of him just disappearing sent a chill down my spine. And that's when the doorbell chimed. I didn't look up immediately. I was so lost in my thoughts, trying to make sense of what had just happened, that the sound didn't register at first. But then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps coming toward me. My heart skipped a beat. I looked up, and there he was, standing in the doorway. 1 minute I was alone, and the next he was there, standing right in front of me. His face was still hard to make out, but I could see his eyes now. They were wide, as if he hadn't slept in days. His hair was messy, his jacket ragged. The air felt thick, heavy, as if something terrible was about to happen. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel my hands trembling. My mouth was dry. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. He didn't respond right away. He just stood there, staring at me. I could feel his gaze on me like it was burning into my skin. It was unsettling. I tried to speak again, but I couldn't find the words. He looked around the store like he was searching for something, or maybe just making sure he was alone. Finally, he spoke. "I need to get something for my family." It wasn't the words, but the way he said it that didn't sit right. It was a lie, a bad one. It didn't make sense, and I knew it didn't. He wasn't here to get anything. His eyes were too wide, his movements too stiff. Before I could say anything, he moved toward me, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I backed away, my feet stumbling a little as my heart raced faster. The next thing I knew, his hand shot out, and in his grip, there was a knife. A sharp, gleaming blade. The glint of it sent a shiver down my spine. "Give me the register," he muttered. It wasn't a demand. It was flat, almost bored. like this was just something he had to do. I could see the handle of the knife trembling in his hand as he moved closer, the blade pointed in my direction. I tried to keep my composure. I could feel my hands sweating and my throat was dry. I needed to stay calm. I needed to think. I looked down at the panic button beneath the counter, the red square. I had read about it in training, but I never thought I'd actually need to use it. My mind was racing, but I knew this was the moment I had to act. In one quick motion, I pressed the button. A quiet beep echoed beneath the counter. He didn't notice at first. He was too focused on me, on what he wanted. But when he heard the sirens in the distance, he looked toward the door. The panic on his face was immediate. I could see it, the moment he realized that his time was running out. He stepped toward me quickly, and I felt his hand on my arm. His grip was cold, tight, and desperate. He was dragging me toward the back of the store, but I was ready. I pulled away as hard as I could, and in that instant, the door burst open. I didn't hear the footsteps or the sound of the officers shouting commands, but I saw them. They rushed in like a wave, two of them in full tactical gear, but one with his gun drawn. His voice boomed as he shouted at the man, telling him to get down on the ground, but the man didn't move. His eyes never left mine. Everything happened so fast. The officers swarmed him, one of them grabbing his shoulders, forcing him to the ground, while the other checked the knife he'd been holding, making sure it wasn't in reach. The scene was a blur of motion, a flash of uniforms, metal cuffs snapping shut, and the harsh sound of my own breath in the silence that followed. I remember standing there, frozen, just staring at them. I couldn't move. My legs felt weak beneath me, like I might collapse any second. I wasn't even sure if my legs were holding me up. The police officer glanced over at me, and for a split second I saw concern in his eyes. "You all right?" he asked, his voice soft, almost hesitant. I tried to speak, but nothing came out at first. My throat was dry, constricted. I just nodded, unable to trust my voice. I wasn't sure if I wanted to speak anyway, not with the adrenaline coursing through me, making everything feel like a fog. My heart was still pounding so loudly in my chest, I thought it might burst. I could feel my pulse in my ears, in my fingertips. As the officer cuffed the man, I took a shaky step back toward the counter. I didn't want to look at the man, but I couldn't stop. His face was pale now, his eyes wide with fear and something else, something darker. He looked like he was about to say something, but whatever words were on his lips died in the air as the officers pushed him toward the door. "You sure you're okay?" One of the officers asked again, more firmly this time. I nodded, my mouth still dry. They took my statement, and then the officers finally left, taking the man with them. I watched them through the window as they shoved him into the back of the patrol car. My hands were still shaking, and I couldn't seem to stop staring at the empty spot where he had stood. I couldn't get rid of the image of his eyes, the way they never left me, even when he was being hauled away. It was like he knew something I didn't, like he was still there, lurking just outside the edges of my mind. It's been a month since the incident, but every time I work that shift, I keep my eyes on the door. Every time I hear the bell chime, I wonder if it's him again. And every time I get that feeling, the same cold, unsettling feeling that no matter how much I try to move on, there's always a part of me that's still trapped in that moment. I've worked night shifts at the same corporate office in California for over 3 years now. My name's Steve, and to be honest, the job's been pretty uneventful most of the time. Nothing too exciting or out of the ordinary happens, just the usual routine of checking the building, making sure the alarms are set, and ensuring everything's locked up tight before the morning crew arrives. It's one of those jobs where you're mostly left alone with your thoughts, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but after a while, the solitude does start to feel a bit unnerving. You get used to the quiet, but deep down, there's always this nagging feeling that something could go wrong, even if it's unlikely. I've always found comfort in the predictable sounds of the office building. The hum of the air conditioning, the flickering of the fluorescent lights overhead, the distant whir of the elevator as it moves between floors. All of it became background noise for me, just a part of the environment that helped pass the long hours from midnight to 6 a.m. The building itself is large, spread across multiple floors, and although most employees are gone by the time my shift begins, the offices always feel so cold, like the place is waiting for someone to return. Maybe it's just my imagination, but there's something about the silence that feels almost oppressive. It's as if the building itself has a life of its own, one that comes to life when you're alone. But that night was different. It started just like any other. I arrived at the office around 11:30 p.m., punched in and started my rounds. The building was eerily quiet, like it always was at night. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of papers in the wind from the air conditioning and the soft beep of the security system confirming that each door was locked. The supply room, where the office stores cleaning equipment and extra office supplies, had always been a little odd to me. It's tucked away at the back of the building, far from the main entrance, and it's locked with a heavy-duty steel door that requires a key card to open. Even though no one ever went in there at night, the door had this heavy, oppressive feel to it, like you weren't supposed to be there. I didn't think much about it. I just made sure it was locked and went on my way. Around 2 a.m., I was making my rounds on the second floor. The building was huge, mostly office spaces, but a few meeting rooms and a couple of supply closets scattered throughout. I'd checked all the usual spots, making sure no doors had been left ajar or anything was out of place. When I reached the end of the hall, I took a left toward the supply room. I noticed something immediately. The supply room door was slightly ajar, just a few inches. Now, I knew I had locked it earlier in my shift. I'm always careful about that. But here it was, wide open, like someone had forgotten to close it. It was dark in there, too. No lights, no sound. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and for a second, I thought maybe I was just imagining it. I stood there staring at the door for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone had gone in to grab something, but there was no reason anyone would be here at this hour, let alone messing around with the supply room. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize it, but the longer I stood there, the more my gut told me something wasn't right. I grabbed my flashlight from my belt and slowly approached the door, my steps deliberate and slow. The cold air in the hallway seemed to get even colder as I got closer to the room. I pushed the door open a little further with my hand, the heavy steel creaking on its hinges. The light from my flashlight cut through the darkness, and I saw nothing out of the ordinary at first, just shelves stacked with cleaning supplies and boxes of paper. But then, I heard it, a loud crash. The sound came from deep inside the room. It was the unmistakable noise of something heavy falling to the floor, maybe a box or a metal container. My heart leaped in my chest. I immediately stepped back, my hand tightening around the flashlight. It was the kind of noise that made your instincts kick in, made you want to run, but also made you feel like you needed to figure out what had happened. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty hall. No answer. I waited a few seconds, but there was no movement, no sound from inside the room. I pushed the door open fully and stepped into the room, the beam of my flashlight scanning the dark corners. The air in here was stale, damp, even. It smelled of cleaning supplies and the faint musk of cardboard boxes. Nothing. The usual tools were scattered in their places. Nothing out of the ordinary. But the crash, I couldn't shake it. Then I heard something else. Footsteps. Soft, quick footsteps. Almost like someone was trying to move quickly without being heard. My pulse quickened and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I instinctively stepped back into the hallway, but my eyes stayed fixed on the supply room. The footsteps stopped, and then silence. I knew someone had to be in there. There was no way I was imagining this. The thought of someone trespassing in this locked room was enough to make me break out in a cold sweat. But who and why? I grabbed my radio and spoke into it, trying to keep my voice steady. "Control, this is Steve. I've got an issue in the supply room. Someone's in there. I need backup." There was a brief static pause, and then the response came back. "Steve, backup isn't going to be able to make it until morning. Are you sure about this?" I swallowed hard. "Yeah, I'm sure." I wasn't sure what to do. I could call the cops, but that would take too long. And who knew how long this person had been in there, or if they were dangerous. With no other choice, I decided to investigate further. My heart raced in my chest as I cautiously stepped back into the room. The cold air felt like it was seeping through my skin, making my hands shake as I held the flashlight in front of me. I moved toward the back of the room where the sound had come from. That's when I saw it. A stack of boxes had been knocked over, and there were scattered papers on the floor. At first, I thought it was just the mess of someone trying to find something. But then, I noticed something else. The boxes, those weren't just thrown aside. They were intentionally moved. Someone had been searching for something. The room was almost pitch black now, with only the light from my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I made my way further into the room, I froze. There was a figure, a person crouched in the corner by a large filing cabinet. I could barely make out their face, but I saw their eyes, wide, frantic. And in that moment, I realized I'd made a huge mistake. Before I could react, the figure darted toward me. My body slammed into the filing cabinet as I tried to back away, but the person was too fast. He grabbed my arm, pulling me toward him. The flashlight flew from my hand and clattered to the floor, leaving us in almost complete darkness. A scuffle ensued. I struggled to free myself, but he was strong. Too strong. I managed to land a punch to his side, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he pushed me harder, knocking me to the ground. The man spoke between gasps. "You shouldn't be here." I didn't have time to process what he was saying. I was too focused on trying to get away from him, on trying to stop him from hurting me. "Get off me!" I yelled, swinging blindly. In that moment, I realized who this was. It was him. The guy who had been fired months ago for stealing. They'd found stolen equipment in his locker and they'd kicked him out. Apparently, that wasn't enough to stop him. I don't know how it happened, but somehow I managed to wrestle free. The man stood up and bolted, running away into the darkness. I called the cops immediately and told them everything about the situation and about the man. Later that night, I found out he had been caught. He was arrested for trespassing and assault. After that night, I couldn't bring myself to go back to the night shift. It was just too much. I stopped working those hours for good. I still can't shake the feeling of what happened that night. I've worked plenty of late shifts, but that one, it still makes my heart race when I think about it. Maybe I should start at the beginning so you understand just how ordinary this all seemed, up until it wasn't. It was late on a Saturday night, around 2 a.m. The fast food place where I work is always quiet after midnight, especially on weekends when most people are either home or out partying, and nobody wants greasy food at this hour. That's how I ended up stuck with the night shift, alone. I'm Tyler, by the way, just an average 22-year-old who took this job to pay bills and cover rent while I figured out what I wanted to do with my life. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. I wasn't complaining. The shifts usually passed in a blur of cleaning, prepping for the next day, and occasionally, if I was lucky, zoning out while watching a show or scrolling through my phone in the back room. That night was different. I could feel it from the moment I walked in. Maybe it was the weather, overcast skies, that weird chill in the air you get late at night. Or maybe it was just me. I don't know, but something about it had me uneasy from the start. I'd worked a few late shifts before, but tonight felt off. The moment I entered the building, the air was different, colder, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. Maybe it was just the tiredness of a long day catching up with me, or maybe something else was at play. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the creeping sense of discomfort that seemed to settle into the bones of the night. The store was dead. I mean, absolutely empty. The parking lot outside was void of cars, and the dim lights from the highway barely reached the small fast food joint. I locked the door behind me and grabbed my headset, settling into the drive-through window area. The register was already closed, the grill was turned off, and the kitchen was clean. All I had to do was sit and wait for my shift to end. It was always eerie working alone like this. The silence was deafening. Sure, the machines hummed in the kitchen, and the occasional beep from the fryer would break the stillness, but there was no chatter from customers, no other voices in the background. It felt like I was the only person left in the world. I'd gotten used to it over time. The loneliness, the isolation. It became my routine. I'd do my job, clean up, and get ready to leave. But that night, it felt different. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the stillness that felt too heavy, like the air was too thick. It was almost as if the place was holding on to some unspoken secret. Hours passed, and still no one came through the drive-thru. It was a ghost town. I even started getting a little drowsy, my eyes heavy. That's when it happened. The thing I'll never forget. The first knock came without warning. A single, sharp tap against the drive-thru window. I froze. No one had been around for hours. I thought maybe it was an animal at first. Maybe a bird or something had hit the window. But the sound didn't make sense. It was too precise, too intentional. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood up, walking toward the window, feeling a little silly for even thinking it could be anything else. I reached the window, looked outside. Nothing. There was nobody in sight. Not a single car in the parking lot. The only thing I could see was the row of dark trees along the edge of the lot. I took a deep breath and stepped back, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Probably just some strange wind or a loose sign flapping. I was overthinking it. But then, another knock. Tap, tap, tap. I jumped. This time, I had no choice but to open the window and check. My hands were trembling a little as I pulled the latch and slid it up. I glanced out into the cold night air, my breath fogging up the glass. Nothing. That's when I heard it. A voice, muffled but clear, coming from the other side of the drive-through window. "Hey, are you still open?" I blinked, not fully processing what was happening. There was someone out there. But how had they gotten there without me hearing the car pull up? The lot had been empty for hours. I didn't even know how they had approached the window without me noticing. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make out the figure. It was a man, standing just far enough away from the window that I couldn't get a good look at him. He was wearing a hood, a dark jacket, and, what struck me as odd, a ski mask that covered his entire face. "We're closed," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but it was shaky. He didn't move or respond for a moment. The silence dragged on, thick and suffocating. I could feel the weight of his gaze even though I couldn't see his eyes. Something wasn't right about this. "Please," the man said, his voice low and smooth, almost too calm for the situation. "Just a small favor. I really need something to eat. It's just a quick order, I swear." I didn't know what to say. It was unnerving how he wasn't pressing harder for anything. Just asking so casually as if he'd been there all along and this was some normal request. "I'm sorry, I can't do that," I said, trying to keep my tone firm. "We're closed, like I said, you should go." Then something about him shifted. His posture, his energy, it suddenly became off, almost predatory. I could feel my heart begin to pound faster in my chest as he took a step closer to the window, his movements slow, deliberate. The air around me suddenly felt thick, like I was suffocating. "Come on," he urged again, but this time there was an edge to his voice, something that didn't sit right. "I just need one thing. Please." I took a step back, instincts kicking in. Something inside me was screaming, telling me to lock the window and hide. I don't know why, but I felt like I was in danger. Then I heard it. A scraping sound, the unmistakable noise of metal on metal. I glanced down to see the man's hand, covered in gloves, scraping something along the edge of the window, like he was trying to force his way in. I felt panic rise in my throat, my whole body tense. Without thinking, I slammed the window shut and locked it. But he wasn't done. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he said, his voice now strained with something darker, more aggressive. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 9111, but I forced myself to. The phone rang, and I could hear the operator's calm voice as she answered. I told her about the man outside, how he wouldn't leave, and that I was alone in the store. She reassured me that they were sending someone right away. But the man wasn't done. I heard a low, guttural growl as he tried to push against the window, his breath becoming heavier and more erratic. He wasn't even trying to hide his intentions anymore. I backed away from the window, just as the sound of him hammering on the glass broke through the silence. The window shuddered under the force of his blows. My whole body went ice cold as I backed toward the kitchen, keeping my eyes on the window, my heart thudding in my chest. And that's when it happened. I heard a loud crack, and the man's hand shot through the window, grabbing the edge of the frame as he tried to pry it open. The sound of glass grinding against metal was deafening. That's when I saw the gun. He was holding it up now, pointing it directly at me. A black pistol gleaming under the streetlights. He didn't say anything, just stood there. I froze. My legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, staring at the weapon, realizing that my life could end in that moment. The weight of the gun, the look in his eyes, or where I imagined his eyes to be beneath that mask, made it feel like time had stopped. My mind was racing, but my body wasn't cooperating. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the bright, flashing lights of a police car illuminated the parking lot, bathing everything in a blinding white glow. My heart leapt in my chest, and I felt the tension flood out of me, replaced by something else. Panic. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The man froze. His grip on the window loosened, and for a moment, everything was still. The police car screeched to a halt, and I heard the officers yell, "Get your hands up! Step away from the window!" The man's eyes, or whatever was hidden beneath that mask, flicked toward the officers, and in that second, he made a move. He ducked, trying to get away, but it was too late. The police rushed forward, and in moments, they had him cuffed and on the ground. I stayed back, heart still pounding in my chest, watching through the window as they took him away. He was struggling, but it was over. Later, I found out that the guy had been casing places for hours. He had a criminal record, and this was far from his first time doing something like this. That night still haunts me. Every time I think about it, I can still feel the pressure of that gun in the air, the panic, and how close I came to not making it out alive. I'll never forget that feeling of staring out the window and seeing that mask covering everything, except the intent behind it. And that intent, I'll never forget it. It was supposed to be just another one of those sleepovers. You know, the kind you look forward to all week, a time for friends to come together, laugh, and eat way too much junk food. The kind of night where everyone stays up too late playing video games, talking about the most random stuff, and pretending to be too cool for the world. This particular sleepover was at my house in California. My parents had gone out of town for the weekend, and for once, We had the entire house to ourselves. The house itself wasn't anything special. It was a two-story home on the edge of our neighborhood, surrounded by thick trees and low hills that always seemed to hold more than their fair share of secrets. But for the night, it felt like our personal space. We didn't have to worry about anything until we did. There were 6 of us: me, my best friends Sarah and Mike, and the others: Alex, Jasmine, and Ben. We were all packed into the living room like sardines, sitting in front of the TV. The furniture was a little old but comfortable enough, with mismatched cushions that had been thrown across the couches haphazardly. My mom always had candles burning around the house, and the smell of vanilla and something faintly floral filled the room, mixing with the scent of leftover pizza from the evening. The TV was turned up a bit too loud as we were engrossed in some ridiculous video game, taking turns yelling and laughing as we tried to beat each other's scores. It was the usual Friday night chaos, and I honestly didn't think much of it. We'd been at it for hours, and I was starting to feel that tired buzz in my head, the kind you get when you've been awake way too long, but you're too excited to go to sleep. My eyes were focused on the screen, fingers gripped tightly around my controller. The noise of the game, mixed with the laughter of my friends, created this atmosphere that felt oddly charged, as though there was more going on than just a bunch of teenagers playing a video game. We had been playing for what felt like ages when I first heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind. It was always windy in the evenings, especially when it had been hot earlier in the day. We lived near some pretty dense trees, and their branches would often scrape against the house, especially if there was even the slightest breeze. But then the sound came again, louder this time, a sharp grating noise like metal dragging against glass. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't a tree branch. I froze mid-game, my controller still in my hands, but now completely irrelevant. I looked around, trying to get a sense of where the noise was coming from. The others noticed too. Sarah, who had been sitting next to me, paused her controller and turned toward the window. "What the hell was that?" she asked, her voice soft but tense. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew that something wasn't right. It felt like the air in the room shifted. The weight of it became heavier, thicker. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "I don't know," Mike said, his voice flat and indifferent at first, as though trying to brush it off. He didn't like showing fear, so he'd usually act cool even when things weren't cool. But even he seemed to notice it now, his eyes darting toward the window. Everyone was silent for a moment. The scratching had stopped, but it left this weird, almost suffocating silence behind it. You know the kind? The kind that feels like a warning. Like everything is on the edge of something. "I'm going to check it out," Ben said, casually standing up from where he'd been sitting on the armrest of the couch. Ben always acted like the brave one, the one who wasn't afraid of anything, even when I knew he was. It wasn't until later that night that I realized how much he was actually masking his own fear. "Ben, seriously? Don't," I said, not wanting him to make it worse. "It's probably just the wind or something. We're all just freaking out over nothing." And then, there it was again. The scraping. Only this time, it wasn't on the window anymore. It was right outside the door. I could feel the blood drain from my face. The noise was unmistakable now, a slow, deliberate drag of something hard, metal perhaps, across the wood. Whoever or whatever was out there was trying to get in. I felt this gut-deep, primal fear that I couldn't shake. My legs felt like they were glued to the floor as I slowly turned to look at the window again. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest, I was sure everyone could hear it. The scraping noise was getting louder and more persistent, like whoever it was trying to wedge something into the door. Sarah was the first one to speak. "What is that? Is someone trying to get in?" "I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling. Without thinking, I got up and walked toward the window, my feet moving slowly as though I was in some kind of trance. I pulled the curtains back just enough to peek outside, half expecting to see a tree branch or some animal dragging its claws across the glass. But there was nothing there. No animals, no wind, nothing, except for the dark. The backyard stretched out behind the house, dark and empty, with just the faint glow of a streetlight casting long, ghostly shadows across the yard. I felt this chill crawl up my spine, the kind that comes with a sense of being watched. Suddenly, the scraping stopped. For a second, I thought it might be over. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe my brain was just overreacting. But before I could convince myself that everything was fine, the scraping started again. Only now, it was even louder, sharper. And it wasn't just at the window, it was at the door. I turned around to face the others, panic beginning to rise in my chest. Guys, I don't think it's the wind. This is something else. Jasmine, who had been sitting at the far end of the room, stood up and walked to the door. We need to check it out. I'll go. No, no, I shouted, rushing to stop her. Stay inside, don't open the door. But it was too late. She had already reached for the doorknob. And that's when I heard the most terrifying thing of all. A voice. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. Hello? I froze. My whole body went rigid, and I could feel my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't a friendly hello. It was low, slow, and ominous, like someone had been watching us, waiting for us to make a move. My mind went blank for a second, unable to process what was happening. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table and dialed 911 in a panic. My hands were shaking so much I could barely hold the phone steady. I felt like I was going to collapse right there on the spot. 911, what's your emergency? I think someone's trying to break into my house, I gasped into the phone. I could barely get the words out. Please, help. He's outside. He's at the window, at the door. I don't know what to do. The dispatcher was calm, asking for my address and telling me that help was on the way, but it felt like forever. The scraping outside didn't stop. It was like whoever it was taking his sweet time, methodically trying to pry his way in. I could hear my friends moving behind me, their breaths shallow and quick. I could feel them panicking too, but there was nowhere to hide. The doorbell rang, loud and jarring, and everyone jumped, even though it was just the police finally arriving. They were fast, thankfully. It felt like a weight had been lifted from my chest. They managed to catch him while he was fleeing the scene. He thought the house was empty, that there were no lights on and no sounds coming from inside. He was armed. He had a crowbar with him, and the police said he'd already robbed 3 other homes in our neighborhood that night. If we hadn't heard that scraping sound, if we hadn't been awake, who knows what could have happened. The police told us we were lucky. If we had been asleep, if the noise hadn't woken us up, he might have gotten in. And even now, I can't get the sound out of my head. The scraping, the dragging, the way it felt like it was right there with us in that moment. I can still hear it, echoing in the silence of that night. It was the middle of summer, just after school let out. A typical warm California evening, the kind of night where the air felt like a blanket, thick and heavy, with the smell of grass and pine trees. I was staying at my friend Jared's house for the weekend, something we'd done countless times before. Jared lived on the outskirts of town, his house nestled in a quiet corner of our neighborhood, where the streets slowly faded into dirt roads and open fields. The backyard led directly into a dense, almost endless forest. I'd been over at Jared's house plenty of times, and we'd spent countless hours adventuring in the woods when we were younger, but something felt different this time. There was a tension in the air, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Jared's house was a modest 2-story ranch with white siding and a slanted roof. It was the kind of home that always looked lived in, comfortable, but nothing extravagant. The front yard had a few trees, nothing special, and the backyard opened up into a wide stretch of land that sloped down toward the forest. A short wooden fence separated the yard from the thick woods with a narrow, winding trail cutting through the brush that led deeper into the trees. It was a Saturday evening, and we had planned to watch some horror movies and play video games, just like we always did. But after a while, Jared mentioned something that caught my attention, a strange, almost cryptic comment that set the tone for the night to come. "Hey," Jared said nonchalantly as he tossed a pillow at me from across the room, "you ever notice that old shed back in the woods?" I glanced at him, a little confused. "What shed?" Jared shrugged as he leaned back against the couch. "There's this shed, not far from the edge of the yard. You can't see it from the house, but if you walk far enough into the woods, you'll find it. I've seen it a couple of times, but it's weird, kind of creepy." I raised an eyebrow. "Why is it creepy?" Jared thought for a moment before answering. "I don't know. I don't know. It's been there for years and it's old, but there's something about it, something off. I've never really gone close to it, but I always see it out of the corner of my eye when I'm out there." My interest was immediately piqued, and I couldn't let it go. The woods were a place I knew well, but I had never noticed a shed. It was hard to believe that I'd missed something like that, considering how much time I'd spent out there as a kid. But Jared's description stirred up an odd feeling in my gut, one that was more of a curiosity than fear. Still, the fact that Jared seemed hesitant to talk about it only made it more intriguing. "You've never gone to check it out?" I asked, half teasing. "Nah," he said, shaking his head. "Not really. I mean, it's just a shed, right? But it looks abandoned. And when I'm out there, it feels like someone's watching me from inside. It's weird." I couldn't explain it, but there was something in the way he said that last part, something about the look on his face that made me want to know more. Maybe I should have listened to my gut, but instead I shrugged and said, "Well, we should go check it out." At first, Jared laughed it off, clearly thinking I was joking. But the more I thought about it, the more I insisted. Eventually, after some back and forth, Jared reluctantly agreed to come with me. But he made it clear that he wasn't too excited about the idea. I didn't care. I was determined. The air had cooled slightly by the time we decided to head out, and the forest behind Jared's house had already begun to darken, the shadows creeping longer as the sun set behind the trees. It was one of those summer evenings where the light almost seemed to hang in the air, casting everything in a dim orange glow that made everything look surreal. It was quiet, almost eerily quiet. No chirping of birds, no rustling of leaves, just the sound of our shoes crunching against the dry dirt path. We made our way out of the backyard, stepping past the old wooden fence and into the overgrown path that led into the woods. The trees, thick with branches and leaves, blocked out the majority of the fading sunlight, leaving only slivers of light to slip through. The further we walked, the darker it became, and soon it felt like we were engulfed by the forest. The scent of pine needles was strong, mixed with the dampness of the earth and something else, something faintly metallic, almost like blood, though I couldn't place it. I tried to shake the thought, but it lingered. Jared walked a few steps ahead, his head constantly swiveling as if he were looking out for something. His usual confident demeanor seemed a little rattled, though he tried to act like it wasn't. He glanced at me occasionally, his eyes a little too wide, his footsteps just a little too quick. "Right around here," he muttered as he slowed down, stepping off the path and into the underbrush. He motioned toward a group of trees just a few feet away, their trunks twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like hands, and then through the thick trees, I saw it. The shed. It stood like a shadow among the trees, half hidden by overgrown vines and wild brush. The walls were a pale, peeling wood, and the roof sagged in several places, as if it had been there for decades. The The structure was small, maybe no more than 8 feet by 8 feet, and though I had no idea how long it had been abandoned, the condition of the shed told me it had been a long time. We both stood there, staring at it for a long moment, the silence between us growing heavier. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath. Jared shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know about this, man," he said, his voice low. "I really don't like this place. It feels wrong." But I was already moving toward it, my curiosity outweighing my sense of caution. As I stepped closer to the shed, I noticed how the ground around it was trampled, like someone had been walking around it recently. It looked like it hadn't been untouched for as long as Jared had made it sound. I reached out and pushed the door of the shed, which creaked loudly in protest. The smell that hit me was overpowering. Stale air, mold, and something else I couldn't identify. Inside, everything was in disarray, as though someone had been living there. The walls were lined with yellowed, torn posters, some of them faded beyond recognition, others with images of old advertisements and strange symbols. The floor was covered with clutter, empty food wrappers, cardboard boxes, broken furniture. But then I saw it. In the corner of the room, there was a small bed. It looked out of place, an old mattress covered with a faded quilt. The sheets were tangled, the bed in a state of complete disarray as though someone had gotten up abruptly. That's when I noticed the food wrappers scattered across the floor, half-eaten granola bars, empty chip bags, and candy wrappers. Some of them looked old, but others, especially a few of the granola bars, looked fresh, as if someone had just eaten them recently. I shivered, stepping back, my mind racing. But then, just as I was about to say something to Jared, I heard something behind us. Footsteps. Slow and heavy, crunching against the dry leaves. My heart skipped a beat and we both turned around quickly. Standing at the edge of the trees was a man. He was tall, thin, and his face was mostly obscured by the shadow of a dark hoodie. But his eyes glowed in the low light, piercing through the dimness. There was something unnerving about the way he stood. It wasn't just that he was tall or dressed in dark clothing, it was the stillness of him, the way he seemed so out of place. His posture was rigid, as if he'd been standing there for a long time, watching. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, staring at us, his eyes unnaturally bright in the fading daylight. My throat tightened, and before I could move, Jared grabbed my arm. "Get back," Jared whispered urgently, his voice barely audible. "We need to leave." Without thinking, we both bolted, scrambling back toward the woods, our hearts pounding in our chests. The man didn't move at first, but we could hear his heavy footsteps behind us, deliberate and slow, like he was taking his time. I stumbled on the uneven ground, tripping over roots and branches, my mind screaming at me to run faster. Jared was ahead of me, but he was just as panicked. We didn't speak as we ran. Our breath was loud in our ears, our legs moving faster and faster as the dark figure seemed to get closer. We reached the edge of the woods, but we couldn't stop there. The man was gaining on us, and the moment we reached the clearing by Jared's backyard, I thought I heard him shout something, though I didn't dare to turn around. We didn't stop running until we were back inside the house, slamming the door behind us, gasping for air. Jared's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. I collapsed onto the floor, shaking uncontrollably, unable to speak for a few seconds. When I could finally form words, I stammered, We have to call the police." Jared didn't hesitate. His hands shook as he grabbed his phone, dialing the police with trembling fingers. I could barely hear the dispatcher over the rush of blood in my ears, but I managed to tell them everything. About the shed, about the man, and the way everything felt wrong. It felt like an eternity before the officers finally arrived, but when they did, we led them straight back to the woods. They searched the area, and what they found, well, I don't think I'll ever forget it. The man wasn't just a random stranger. He was a fugitive, someone who had been on the run. He had been living in that shed, hiding from the law. The police found evidence, clothes, personal belongings, and enough food wrappers to show he had been living there for quite a while. Jared and I were in shock. We never expected anything like this. We never expected to come face to face with a criminal living in the woods behind Jared's house. The officers told us they'd been looking for him for months. We were lucky we managed to get out of there unharmed. They tracked footprints deeper into the forest, following the trail for several hundred yards. At the very edge of the woods, they found a small campsite just off a hidden trail we never knew existed. There were more signs of the man's presence: a broken tent, some old tarps, a fire pit, and some more of the food wrappers we'd seen earlier. But the most chilling part was what the police uncovered next. The fugitive was still nearby. Suddenly we heard shouting. The police had spotted him. He was trying to run. A flurry of movement erupted in the woods as officers chased after him, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I could hear him scrambling through the underbrush, cursing under his breath. He wasn't going to go down without a fight. The officers' radios crackled with commands, but the man was fast, ducking between the trees, disappearing into the thick forest. I felt my stomach turn as I imagined him slipping further away. But then, just as quickly, there was the sound of someone crashing to the ground. The fugitive had tripped. "Stop! Police!" an officer shouted, and there was a loud scuffle, followed by the unmistakable sound of handcuffs clicking shut. Moments later, 2 officers appeared, dragging the man back toward us. His face was twisted with anger, and he was struggling, but the officers held firm. He had been caught. The whole experience left us shaken. Even after the police left, I couldn't shake the image of the man's glowing eyes staring at us from the woods. We still talk about that night sometimes. We don't go near the woods anymore. And every time I look out toward the trees, I wonder how many other people are out there, hiding, waiting for the moment to strike. It's strange how something so ordinary can become a haunting memory that lingers for years. Even now, I can't shake the feeling of unease from that night. What was supposed to be a fun sleepover at my best friend Katie's house turned into an experience I'll never forget. It started on a typical Friday afternoon. I was 16, looking forward to the weekend when Katie invited me to her house for a sleepover. Katie and I had been best friends since elementary school, and I never hesitated to accept her invites. It felt like we'd always have fun, no matter what we did. Katie lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Southern California. Her house wasn't anything extraordinary, just a 2-story home with beige siding and a cozy front porch with a few flower pots. The kind of house you'd see in any neighborhood. A big backyard with an old swing set sat behind the house, surrounded by overgrown bushes. It had that familiar, welcoming feeling to it, but nothing about it ever seemed unusual. I arrived around 4 p.m., stepping out of the car to the familiar scent of the warm California air, with a slight salty breeze from the ocean just a few miles away. The sun hung low in the sky, casting everything in a golden hue, the kind of perfect weather you only get once in a while. I smiled to myself as I walked up the front steps, where Katie was waiting with a grin. We exchanged greetings, and I immediately felt at home. Her younger sister, Emily, was busy playing with her toys in the living room. Emily was around 9 years old at the time, a bundle of energy with long brown hair and a mischievous streak. She was a little more outspoken than most kids, often coming up with wild stories, but we all chalked it up to her imagination. She loved the attention her tales got, and we all indulged her. Katie and I often joked that Emily had a flair for drama, but it was all in good fun. "Come on, let's get settled in," Katie called, leading me inside. Emily waved absent-mindedly from her spot on the floor, too focused on her game to pay us any mind. We spent the first couple of hours like we always did, catching up, laughing about the latest school gossip, and chatting about whatever was on our minds. It felt like the kind of easy evening you wish could last forever. The house had that warm glow in the kitchen from the overhead lights, while the rest of the house was shrouded in soft shadows as the sun sank beneath the horizon. It was then that Emily's voice suddenly broke the peace. "Guys, I saw someone in the hallway again," she said casually, as if she were describing a routine event. Katie and I froze, exchanging a brief, confused glance. Emily had always been imaginative, claiming to see things like monsters or strange figures at night. We'd dismissed her stories in the past, thinking they were just products of an active imagination. But this time, the way she spoke sounded different. Someone? What do you mean, someone? Katie asked, a teasing smile on her lips. Emily shrugged, not looking up from her toys. "I don't know. It's like a shadow. It walks from the stairs to the kitchen." Katie laughed, but it was a strange laugh, forced and nervous. It was unlike her usual carefree tone. "Oh, come on, Emily," she said with a half-hearted smile. "You're just imagining things." I stayed quiet for a moment, but something about the way Emily said it didn't sit right with me. Her tone was quiet, almost too serious for a 9-year-old. I'd known Emily long enough to tell when she was just being silly, and this time I didn't think she was. "Well, maybe you're just tired," I suggested gently, trying to ease the tension. "Maybe it's just shadows playing tricks on you." Emily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared intently at the hallway, her eyes fixed on something invisible to us. After a few moments, she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "I see it all the time. Someone walks by, but I can't see their face. It's just a shadow, but it's real." Katie rolled her eyes, dismissing it. Okay, Emily, you're being dramatic again. Just go to bed already." Emily sighed dramatically, crossing her arms. "Fine," she muttered, clearly disappointed. "But I'm telling you, someone's in the house." With that, Emily shuffled off to her room, leaving Katie and me to continue our evening. We didn't pay much more attention to it after that, brushing it off as the typical overactive imagination of a younger sibling. Kids always had weird stories, right? But as the evening went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a strange heaviness in the air, an almost palpable tension. Every now and then I found myself glancing toward the hallway, half expecting to see movement, but every time nothing was there. Still, the house felt too quiet, too still. It was an unsettling feeling that I couldn't quite place. By the time it was dark outside, the atmosphere in the house had changed. It felt wrong. We were in the living room, sprawled on the floor in sleeping bags, flicking through Netflix, but neither of us was really paying attention to the screen anymore. I kept looking up at the hallway, convinced I would see something out of the corner of my eye, but nothing. Then, at around 11 p.m., I heard it. A soft creak. I immediately froze. It wasn't loud, just a subtle sound, like a floorboard groaning under pressure. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, a normal creak you get when the temperature drops. But then I heard it again. This time, it was louder. Footsteps, slow, deliberate steps coming from upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Katie, nudging her. Katie froze, her eyes wide. "Yeah. What is that?" We both sat in silence, listening. The footsteps continued, slow and measured, moving down the hallway above us. Every instinct in me told me something was wrong. The steps weren't random house noises. They were too purposeful, too quiet, like someone was trying to sneak around. Katie grabbed my arm, her voice barely a whisper. "Is someone in the house?" I don't know," I whispered back, my voice shaking. The footsteps paused for a moment, as if the person upstairs had stopped to listen. My breath caught in my throat. Then they started up again, growing louder as they seemed to approach the stairs, moving toward the living room. We both stood up slowly, unsure of what to do. Katie's parents weren't home. There was no reason for anyone to be walking around. I cautiously approached the hallway, moving as quietly as I could. Every step felt like an eternity. The footsteps grew louder, now almost directly above us. I looked toward the stairs, my heart pounding. I peered into the dark hallway, straining to see anything. The light from the kitchen barely reached that far, and the rest of the house was shrouded in shadows. There was no one there. No movement. Relieved, I let out a breath, wondering if it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then, as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't the shape of anything I recognized. It was just a dark, shifting blur sliding across the doorway. It was quick, too quick to be natural. I saw it for just a moment before it disappeared into the darkness. My heart raced. This wasn't just a trick of the light. There was something, or someone there. A figure, moving silently just outside our view. I spun around to Katie, whose face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Katie nodded, her hands trembling. "We need to call the cops. Now." We grabbed our phones in a hurry, dialing 911 as we heard a new sound. Click. The man, whoever he was right there. We backed away, our hearts pounding in our chests. A tall figure stepped into the doorway, his face hidden by the shadows. His movements were deliberate, almost too calm for someone who had just snuck into the house. Katie was already on the phone with 911, her fingers shaking as she relayed our location. The man didn't notice us right away. He was focused on something. But when he turned and saw us standing there, his eyes locked with mine, wide with panic. I don't know how long we stood there, frozen in place. But then the man bolted. He ran toward the back door, disappearing into the yard and into the night. Within minutes, the police arrived. They checked the house, making sure everything was secure. They confirmed the man had entered through the kitchen window and had been hiding in the house. He had been there for hours, watching us, waiting for the right moment. They eventually caught him a few blocks away. Turns out, he had been breaking into homes in the area, looking for an opportunity to steal. In the end, we learned that Emily's warnings weren't just random imagination. She had seen him, sensed his presence even before we did. She had been right all along. It's been years since that night, but I still remember the feeling of that shadow crossing the doorway. The memory still sends chills down my spine whenever I think about it. I guess sometimes kids do see things we don't. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.